Well, staying in the region, Israeli forces have stepped up raids across the occupied West Bank from Ramallah, Bethlehem to Nablus. They've killed dozens of Palestinians, including children, since the start of the war, and dozens of Palestinian bodies have been confiscated by Israel in the West Bank. Human rights organizations fear many more have been taken from Gaza. Well, for more on the war, let's cross live to the Israeli city of Tel Aviv and speak with Arise special correspondent Karl Bostic. Karl, it's always a pleasure to have you. Good afternoon and welcome to Newsday. Now, I'll get straight into it. Can you give us more details about Defense Secretary Lloyd Austins' visit? And are these high-level visits by U.S. officials making any impact at all in getting Israel to change its strategy?
Good afternoon. That's a very good question, a tough question to answer, because now it's been more than 10 weeks since the war has started. Lloyd Austin himself arriving in Israel for the first time only a week after the October 7th massacre, which started the war, and now he's returning for a second visit. Even though the U.S. is Israel's biggest, most important ally and partner overall historically, the U.S. can only give advice, and the U.S. cannot, Israel cannot ignore it. And the advice here is really now more blunt, more precise. From the very beginning, he had told Israel, listen, you don't need to overwhelm them with numbers. You need to go in there with targeted, precise operations. And you need to also be very careful about how you do your bombing. Again, General Austin, he has the unique perspective of having commanded wars in Afghanistan, in Syria, and also, of course, Iraq. And more importantly, he has experience in urban warfare. And that's why he's saying, just to be, bombing at this high rate when you're causing a lot of civilian casualties, he's saying you may have a tactical victory, but that's what. But instead, you're creating a strategic defeat that you're referring to. And by strategic defeat, he's saying all you're just simply doing is you're actually increasing recruitment for groups like Hamas, and you're actually driving up popular support for resistance, especially when you have these casualty rates now approaching 20,000. Now it's being said more than 90% of the population of Gaza, that's 2.3 million overall, so more than 2 million who've had to move, who've had to be displaced. Again, Gaza is no more than a quarter the size of Abuja, and now that 90% is in the southern half of Gaza. In other words, an eighth the size of Abuja. And to give you a sense of just how catastrophic this is in a humanitarian point of view, Médecins Sans Frontières, they're now saying that the whole water system is collapsed, separate from the hospital system collapsing. That now in Gaza, people only have 1 liter of water to drink, to wash, and to cook from. And that's all they have each day to survive. And he's saying that with that kind of a strategy, you're just simply going to, heighten resentment against Israel and actually increase support for Hamas. And then the latest tragedy over the weekend, where you have 3 Israeli hostages actually shot and killed by mistake by Israeli forces because of the heat of the battle.
Well, Karl, can you bring us up to date on what we know, or what you know, about the 3 hostages that were killed by mistake, by the Israeli forces?
All I can tell you is that, ever since October 7th, the whole country, Israel, has really been traumatized by the massacre and the events and the atrocities of October 7th. And what transpired on Friday, some are calling it the darkest day of the war. Darkest day because, you already had more than 1,200 people killed on October 7th. And then you had about 250 people kidnapped, brought into Gaza. So far, about 110 or so have been released. Still, you have about 129 people in captivity. And now this incident has just really shaken everyone. And it's just incredible to understand about it. We weren't on the ground, but very simply put, they were in the Shujaiya camp in North Gaza. One thing to keep in mind is this: when Israel says they're in control of an area, that's maybe operational control on the ground. But still the core of Hamas fighters is underground because they have a vast tunnel network. So what happened was you had a situation where, because it was an active combat zone, where Israeli soldiers were looking for tunnel shafts, were looking to clear buildings in this dense urban environment, they had abandoned some of their hostages. They saw that as an opportunity to escape. They took off their shirts. They used leftover food to draw in big bright letters and read, "Help us, save us, SOS, we're Israelis." All of that was written in Hebrew. You can see it on the walls. And they came out, with their hands up, waving the white, makeshift flag out of a shirt. And instead, the Israeli soldiers opened fire on them. Two of them were killed, and one of them ran back into the building. And the Israeli soldiers ordered him to come back out. He was screaming in Hebrew that he was Israeli and he had been a hostage. And they still opened fire again and shot and killed him. So that's 3 hostages right there. And that's why people are saying that war has not, produced results to bring back home hostages. In fact, it's just done the opposite. By increasing this war offensive, all you're doing is bringing back hostages in body bags. That's why there need to be negotiations. Now, that's why there's so much now domestic and public pressure for the Netanyahu government to reprioritize, to put the return of the hostages ahead of the military offensive. Basically, the thinking is this: you can have weeks, months, or even a year to dismantle, destroy Hamas and to kill its leadership. But it's really hour to hour, day to day for the hostages who may not be alive the next day because of deteriorating conditions. And now Israel is saying that changing its protocol, because some are saying that, well, if they'd been Palestinian, they would have been shot anyway. So now they made a video saying that if you are a Gazan, even if Gazans are holding up a white sheet to surrender, you must not shoot them. You must not shoot them. A final note is this: a lot of these soldiers are young and inexperienced. The ones who were killed were in their mid-20s. These soldiers themselves were like in their 20s as well. So at the same time, you've got young soldiers, inexperienced, who not only may be jittery, but also frightened. And only days ago, you had a double ambush where 9 soldiers were killed. So that's the environment that they're operating in. And that's why, the visit by Lloyd Austins is saying, you need to really, dial back these ground operations and aerial support. And you need to really focus on targeted raids to avoid disasters like this.
Right. Now, just to piggyback off what you're saying, we're hearing there's more international pressure on Israel expected to come. Do you have any further information on this?
Well, you already mentioned there's a vote expected to come before the Security Council. This is like maybe the 3rd or 4th resolution. This one, again, is being tabled by the United Arab Emirates. It's calling for an urgent and sustainable ceasefire. The language is very interested. That language of urgent and sustainable ceasefire, that's language being used by the British Foreign Secretary David Cameron and also the German Foreign Minister Anna Baerbock, where they wrote a joint op-ed piece over the weekend calling for an urgent and sustainable ceasefire. The problem is this kind of resolution has been vetoed by the U.S. In the past. All it will simply do is that the international pressure has only intensified against Israel. Israel's standing more isolated in its approach. And to give an example of just why, there's so much outrage, and again, going back to General Austin's visit, he wants to know, what kind of munitions are you using? And the reason why U.S. cannot ignore the U.S., but they can ignore the UN, is because Israel gets its munitions, gets its bombs from the U.S., and the U.S. so far has placed no conditions on it. And so that's why they have to listen to the U.S., but they can ignore the UN. And the part of the problem with the U.S., with Israel, is that, more than half their bombs, almost half their bombs, are dumb bombs, which you should not use in densely populated areas. They're only using precision bombs for about 45% of the time. And this is bombing that goes back to World War II. The carpet bombing in Dresden, where you had 25,000 civilians killed in a short amount of time. We're already near 20,000 in Gaza. And that's the kind of thing that the Security Council wants to avoid. They're saying, we don't want to repeat the horrors of World War II. In fact, that's why the UN was created.
Well, Karl, what more can you tell us about that, if anything, if you have any information about what the Israeli military has discovered about Hamas's tunnel system?
It's very, very fascinating. I think what's kind of jarring is this. Israel has always been saying for years that we know that they have tunnels under Gaza. They talk about it almost as though it's part of their script, but we've never seen it graphically. And now over the weekend, what they've done, they've taken Israeli media into Gaza to show what they've discovered. They've discovered about 4 kilometers of a tunnel wide enough to drive a small car through. Wide enough to drive motorbikes through. going, for miles, several miles. They took journalists just for the first 100,000 meters, for example, and the tunnel shaft ended just beyond the Erez border crossing, where people go into Israel from the Gaza, just 400 meters away. A tunnel shaft so wide. But what really struck people is this: if you knew so much about these tunnels, how come you didn't know where these tunnels were? Because those were the tunnels shafts on October the 7th. When the Hamas fighters came into Israel, they actually came into Israel over ground and breached the border. But when they took the hostages back, they took them back through the tunnels. What it also shows that this vast network of tunnels that goes for hundreds of miles, they're also saying that how the heck could you build such a tunnel system unless you had a lot of financial support? And it's obvious that a lot of the money that Hamas had received, over the 15 years, have been diverted to build this tunnel system. I think the final thing I'll simply point out is this. They've been in power for 15 years. They've had a long time to fortify themselves, to build this tunnel system, to fortify refugee camps like Jabalia and Shejuaya, where you had these tragedies happening, and they're fortified also with booby traps. So now this is why we're seeing, a day-to-day tragedy unfolding. And now this is just another example with this tunnel system. But also, more disturbingly, it shows that, Israel knew about it, but did nothing about it. And it's yet another intelligence failure, if not a black eye, for the Netanyahu government.
Right. Rise News special correspondent Karl Bostic, thank you so much for your detailed and extremely insightful analysis. We appreciate you here.